Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. We are delighted to be joined today by Ambassador Ryan Crocker, veteran diplomat who served as United States Ambassador to Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, and Lebanon, as well as Pierre Ghanem, senior correspondent for Al Arabiya, for a discussion on Lebanon's immense challenges and future options following the tragic explosion that shocked the country and the world on August 4th. Moderating today's program is Jason Isaacson, AJC Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer. After we hear from Ambassador Crocker, Pierre, and Jason, we will take your questions. You may email your questions to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. Jason, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this special AJC examination of the humanitarian and political situation in Lebanon, 17 days after the devastation of the August 4th blast at Beirut port. Since that catastrophic explosion of some 2,700 tons of warehoused ammonium nitrate, which leveled whole blocks in Beirut, could be felt as far away as Cyprus, and had a force equivalent to the US military's highest yield conventional bomb times 100. The Lebanese people have received expressions of sympathy and solidarity from across the globe. The international community has been summoned to provide assistance, and the Lebanese government has resigned en masse. Lebanese have been in the streets for more than 2 weeks, not only trying to salvage and restore order to their shattered capital, but to express their frustration with a government and a system of government that is routinely described as dysfunctional, riddled with corruption, and of course also to a large degree under the thumb of Hezbollah, the Iranian terrorist proxy that is also a powerful Lebanese political party. These demonstrations against the Lebanese status quo are actually, I hope I said Iranian proxy, not Lebanese proxy, Iranian proxy. These demonstrations against the Lebanese status quo are actually a continuation of months of unrest. The so-called October Revolution, which began last year, was called to protest rising taxes and abysmal government services as Lebanon struggled with a stagnant economy and a 40+ percentage rate of unemployment. We'll spend this hour discussing the Lebanese political power sharing system and its impact on society, the August 4th disaster and its implications, Lebanon's place in the regional strategic architecture, and whether and how it will be possible to rebuild Beirut, reform the national government, and once and for all, free Lebanon from the grip of Iranian influence. We're so honored that joining us for this discussion are Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who served as the American ambassador to Lebanon and 5 other countries, and is one of our country's most respected and experienced diplomats, and Pierre Ghanem, the Washington-based senior correspondent for Al Arabiya News Channel, and a past AJC Global Forum participant. Gentlemen, I'd like to pose a few questions to start us off, and then we'll take questions from our viewers. But before I begin, please allow me to welcome you, Ambassador, and you, Pierre, to AJC Advocacy Anywhere.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Jason. It is my honor.
Let's begin. The Lebanese political system is in shambles. Its financial system is collapsing, and a terror organization with one of the most powerful militaries in the region is continually stoking sectarian tensions and weakening the Lebanese state. With all of these significant issues, where do you begin when addressing how to help the people of Lebanon? And Ambassador, I think I'd like to begin with you.
I think you said it yourself, Jason, just now. It needs to be an organized, orchestrated humanitarian response, working through entities on the ground. A number of non-governmental organizations have had a sustained presence there, including Mercy Corps, on whose board I sit. That has to be the immediate imperative. It's also important, of course, because, as you note, the Lebanese government is riddled and rife with corruption. This assistance, so badly needed, cannot go through the government at this point. Fortunately, there are alternatives, and I think it's very important on anyone who wishes a better future for the Lebanese, and that should be all of us, need to avail themselves of those non-governmental channels.
Pierre, would you like to jump in?
Sure. Well, I would like to maybe say that there are three natural approaches to the situation at this moment. The first one is to put more pressure on Hezbollah and try to separate Hezbollah from the government of Lebanon. The second line is to send direct help to the Lebanese people, especially who were hit by this explosion. The third one is to keep a little bit of faith in the government of Lebanon, but I'm not saying in here the ministries as much as I'm saying the Lebanese army. That this is one of the institutions that the US government worked with and invested in for a very long time. It proved to be one resilient body, and it is a partner, and we need to keep faith on it and help.
Let me stay with you, Pierre, and ask you a follow-up question, and then we'll go back and forth. The carnage from Beirut's August 4th blast is heartbreaking, of course. In the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, we have seen a high-level visit from President Macron of France, followed by the resignation of the Lebanese government. As public anger and frustration rise, what comes next for the people of Lebanon?
Well, you know, I have family back home, and I do have a lot of feeling, and I feel their pain. The situation is dire, and if I give you a description, it may help me presenting a little bit of an image. What we are seeing and what we saw at the port of Beirut is a manifestation of a catastrophe that happened some time ago. Now, what we are seeing in the streets, what we saw in the port of Beirut, is the bottom of a catastrophe that happened some time ago. People lost their money in the banks. $130 billion were lost in the banks that the government took and have no plans of sending it back to the people and to the banks. Many people do not have any more money to buy from the grocery store. People are really trying to go back to a kind of primitive living by like planting potato and trying to harvest tomato and other things. Then the situation is so bad. Then people need help. But we need to understand, at least in my view, that the situation in Lebanon is a financial collapse. It is a terrorist organization that is controlling the government of Lebanon, and people are desperate. To be honest, I don't know where to start, except to say that the US government and the people who may have interest in Lebanon needs to have a very detailed plan to help the people of Lebanon to get out from this terror state or separate themselves from this terror inflicted on them by Hezbollah and try to take back their country.
Ambassador, what's your sense of the U.S. response to the blast? Has the U.S. Jumped in?
It has, Jason, and I've been pleased and a little bit surprised to see it. David Hale, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, career Foreign Service officer, and a former ambassador, has been out there very publicly. There was, I think, a strong inclination on the part of the current U.S. administration just to ignore the whole thing. They did not. Ambassador Hale went out there, made a clear statement in support of the Lebanese people, if not the Lebanese government. And I think we can build on that. But again, I think it has to be a carefully calibrated effort on behalf of the Lebanese people, excuse me, not on behalf of the, Professor Ghanem said several things very important just now. The collapse of the financial system. Look, I spent 6 years out in Lebanon, 3 years as political counselor, 81 to 84, and then as ambassador, 90 to 93. Throughout all of that chaos, the financial system stood strong because the central bank of Lebanon was seen as an institution in which the international community had to have confidence. If the Lebanese understand anything, it is finance, and they understood the role of the central bank. Well, that's gone. The central bank is now just another pawn in the Lebanese chess game, and that is devastating. So understanding the pain the Lebanese are feeling, we have all got to be careful to be sure we do not fuel the elements of corruption. And that is why I say at this point, we have got to work through NGOs that we can trust and that are accountable, and hope to build from that to something else. The last thing I would say in that regard, again, and echoing Dr. Ghanem, there is one functional institution, that is the Lebanese Armed Forces. And I hope we'll have a chance to get into that in a little more depth, because I do think that is very important.
Well, actually, let's get into that now, Ambassador, since you've raised it. As you know, there's some controversy about whether the Lebanese Armed Forces is doing the job that one would expect it to do to make sure there's only one military power in Lebanon. Of course, there is not only one military power. There is Hezbollah with a very substantial force. Is there some, I think there are also accusations of a certain degree of collusion, or at least acquiescence by the Lebanese Armed Forces to Hezbollah's role. How do you get around that dilemma?
Well, again, it is hardly a new problem. I was in Lebanon as ambassador in the early 90s when we reinstituted our support for the Lebanese Armed Forces, starting with non-lethal equipment. Why? Because I saw it then, as I see it now, as imperative to build a capability of an armed forces that in the future, if not in the present, can secure the country and to also secure the country from outside interventions. That's not where we are now, but it is where we can build for the future. I was in Lebanon last about 18 months ago with, as chair of a RAND Corporation board. Our security was provided by the Lebanese Armed Forces. The captain in charge of that endeavor had been to U.S. infantry basic officer training, advanced officer training, and ranger school. He has his Rangers tab. Most American soldiers who go to Ranger school wash out. He was part of that capable and committed minority who went all the way through it and received his tabs. That's the future of Lebanon, and frankly, for the region. This is an armed force who has followed U.S. training, U.S. doctrine, and U.S. equipment. I am by no means advocating a military coup here. I'm simply saying that there is one U.S.-oriented, capable institution in the country, and those are the Lebanese Armed Forces. To say we should cut off aid to the armed forces, I understand the debate. That is going to make a bad situation immeasurably worse.
But it's not a force that's capable of confronting Hezbollah.
No, it's not. And again, this is interesting. Back at the time when I was in Lebanon, we talked about Hezbollah, we talked about Iran, but the real bear in the closet, of course, or out of the closet, was Syria. That the Syrians would not permit, would not do this, would do that, so forth and so on. Well, Syria is no longer a player because of their own internal convulsions, and yet the broad situation is still the same. And I think we need to look at that more carefully. That Iran has its own problems. The Iran-Syrian axis is as strong as it ever was, unfortunately. But what are the means of putting effective pressure against Hezbollah? I can frame the question. I can't supply the answer.
Pierre, let me turn back to you. And let's talk about the verdict a couple of days ago from the UN Special Tribunal for Lebanon, which declared that there was so-called, quote, no evidence that Hezbollah or the Syrian government were behind the assassination of former Prime Minister Hariri. Was that surprising? Furthermore, does it mean that one Hezbollah member who was the one found guilty in this after a decade of investigation and trial was found guilty of having organized and conducted the attack? Does that make sense that one Hezbollah operative did this, but Hezbollah itself did not? It really beggars the imagination to figure out how that could be the case. What is your interpretation of the verdict of the special tribunal?
Allow me, please, first, Jason, to address Mr. Ambassador and tell him that I'm no a PhD person. I'm no professor. I'm just a Pierre. I call you Mr. Ambassador. You call me Pierre. Thank you. Jason, you may be right in saying that only one person from Hezbollah was indicted. The rest didn't have enough proof on them. But this did not exonerate Hezbollah as an organization. And it did not exonerate also the Syrian regime and maybe Iran. Because if someone was listening and spent the time listening to the judges speaking, they were saying that what happened in the killing of Hariri can't be done by one person. It was done with a huge and well-organized body. Then there is an indirect indictment of Hezbollah and the backers of Hezbollah. But what they did is, from the very technical point of view as a tribunal, they were saying that we are beyond doubt. We were able to say that Salim Ayyash did this, and he is a person who was involved in the crime. He committed the crime, and we have no doubt about it. The others may probably help, but we could not, as judges, say beyond doubt that they were part of this crime and they knew exactly what they were doing, and we have the proof that they knew what they were doing. Now, it was a big disappointment for many Lebanese people because it did not really give this feeling of justice to people who felt that Rafiq Hariri was killed. 21 other people were killed. So many others were injured. And obviously, the people of Hezbollah and the people who support Hezbollah were cherishing in the streets, saying, you know, this exonerated Hezbollah. Now, where do we go from here? Is that it is clearly that Hezbollah want to invest on this so-called victory for them, and they will be investing on it, and they will be trying to gain more political power and inflict more terror on the Lebanese people.
Pierre, though, explain to our viewers why it was in the interest of Syria and Iran to eliminate Hariri.
My assessment is that Hariri, with other Lebanese leaders like Walid Jumblat, felt that the Syrian regime was really oppressing them. That's one. And especially Rafiq Hariri has been like paying millions of money to keep the Syrians quiet. And sometimes, as you could look at the indictment, the head of intelligence, Syrian intelligence in Beirut, used to call him and tell him, we want 50 million or we want 60 million. And the guy had to send his driver with the cash money to Rustam Ghazali to pay him the money. And most of the time, Hariri didn't know why he is paying this money. Then they did everything possible to terrorize this great guy. Then Hariri wanted the Syrian to get out. Walid Jumblat wanted the Syrians to get out. Other people who felt that we are really living under a very heavy-handed occupation that is corrupting also the country, we want them out. Then the Syrian came to the point where they felt that if we are staying in Lebanon, we don't want Hariri alive. And if we are leaving, we don't want him to be alive behind us because he is too strong and very rich, and the guy made a great success politically in Lebanon. And if I may, and I'm so sorry to put it this way, Jason, the killing of Hariri was not only a crime, it was a It was a political crime that is paying off for Hezbollah and Syria. Because with the killing of someone like Hariri and other 40 people, and one of them that is my family, Ghanem, okay, were killed. Those people were killed because they don't want anyone behind them to organize and against them and against Hezbollah. And what they did was a crime, a very successful crime.
Oh, thank you, Pierre. It's very painful that a member of your own family was involved in this as well. Ambassador, let me turn to you. Can you discuss the role of UNIFIL, the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, and its role in helping to keep the border of Israel and Lebanon stable? Does the mandate of UNIFIL need to be strengthened to address Hezbollah activities and growing instability in the north of Israel and south of Lebanon? With the UNIFIL mandate now up for renewal in the United Nations, can we not require that it do one of the main jobs it was created for, to disarm Hezbollah?
Well, Jason, that's a great question. I smiled a bit when you spoke the full name of UNIFIL, the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon. Well, it's been the interim force in Lebanon for more than 3 decades. The mandate is flawed. It is a peacekeeping force. It is not a peacemaking force. It could be far more effective. That is not the fault of the organization or its troop contributors. It would need a much stronger mandate. And the likelihood of getting that out of the United Nations Security Council today is exactly what it has been for the last 3 decades, which is nil. That won't happen. All of that said, it does, just by its existence, provide a measure of stability and a measure of encouragement to the Lebanese that they are not entirely forgotten, that there is an international force there. It has been there. It will continue to be there for some time. But I see frankly, no likelihood at all that it could get a stronger mandate than it currently has. UNIFIL doesn't write its own rules of engagement. Those are written in New York. And I do not see the Security Council stepping up to this particular problem anytime soon. Again, there is an irony. One thing that UNIFIL participated in that was highly positive at the end of the 1990s was the demarcation of the border. For all of the violence we've seen across that border, the border itself has never been in dispute between Lebanon and Israel. The Lebanese government has never engaged in combat with the Israeli state. That goes all the way back to the beginning. So it is the one area where we do have a recognized border, and the United Nations played, I think, a positive role in having that demarcated. Look, I just have to say, again, I spent a lot of my life in Lebanon, scarred by it. Rafiq Hariri became prime minister when I was ambassador. He and I had a number of very important consultations, one of which was on the role of the Lebanese army and the issue of sovereignty. I mean, this was the time, 1990, 1991, when all of the militias were disarmed, including the Lebanese forces, including Walid Jumblat's Progressive Socialist Party militia, except Hezbollah. The prime minister was prepared to take that on, and he did. He issued a statement effectively calling for the Lebanese army to relieve Hezbollah of its positions and return those to state authority. Well, he got hauled to Damascus the next day and read the Riot Act. So what led up to 2005 had a long period of incubation. A very courageous individual ultimately killed, basically, not by that single operative, but by the institution of Hezbollah with Iran and Syria standing squarely behind them. Pierre mentioned Walid Jumblat. Well, Walid's father was killed by the Syrians. No secret there, everyone knows it. So lots of blood on a lot of hands. I would have to say again, this is a time for creative thinking. Syria is not in a position, of course, to exercise the kind of macro control over Lebanon that they did before their own civil war. Hezbollah has been more than occupied trying to keep the Syrian regime in power. Even worse, from their standpoint, they are now seen as having effective control over many aspects of the Lebanese government. What does that mean? They bear a burden of responsibility for the blast in the Beirut port. So if they want power, then they're going to have to accept accountability. If they won't accept accountability, others are going to have to find means to pressure them. But I do think there is an opportunity here out of this tragedy that affords the international community, if it can stay focused and stay coordinated, to bring about the dynamics for a better outcome than we have seen in the past.
Let's stay on this issue of putting pressure on Hezbollah, because as you may know, our organization has been pressing European governments to fully designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. Of course, the United States designates it. Germany just adopted that position this spring. Will that kind of political pressure have some effect? We have to do something to make it plain to the world that this is an outlaw organization that conducts terrorist activities on different continents and has its fingers on the throat of Lebanon for decades.
Well, Jason, I think that's exactly the point. And we need to develop a strategy and then sustain this. I'm delighted to see President Macron showing an interest in Lebanon. There is a long historical relationship, of course, between France and Lebanon, centered on the Maronite community in Lebanon. Unfortunately, this comes at a time of almost total detachment by the current administration in Washington from the issues of the Middle East and certainly from the issue of Lebanon. That's why I mentioned the visit of David Hale. You do not see a lot of media coverage of Ambassador Hale. He keeps a low profile, but clearly the administration saw it in our interest to signal our concern over what is happening in Lebanon by sending him out there. So I think we can build on that. I think we can perhaps find more effective traction vis-a-vis Hezbollah, not by restating what we all know to be so painfully true, their support for terrorism at home and abroad, but their unfitness for governance. They've maneuvered themselves into a position where effectively they control strategic decision-making on the part of the government of Lebanon. How's that working? Well, not so great when the port of Beirut blows up with tons and tons of explosives that they should have taken care of if they presume to govern. So I think a broader strategy here would be to hang this incident on them, not because they planted the car bomb, as they did to kill Rafik Hariri in 2005, but because they are not capable of good governance. And that may be a way nothing else has.
Well, let's hope the United States can maybe coordinate with France, particularly on this issue. Pierre, let me turn to you now. Earlier this week, there was some interesting news. Let me just kind of depart from what we've been discussing to a kind of a regional question. Earlier this week, it was reported that Lebanese President Michel Aoun, an ally of Hezbollah, was entertaining the idea of peace with Israel. I'm sure you saw that report. In your view, what are the chances of Israel and Lebanon at some point sitting down to the negotiating table? Is that in the cards?
I'm not sure about the statement of Michel Aoun. To start with the situation in Lebanon, the answer is, the short answer is no. Hezbollah controls the political arena and has 100 and more rockets and is
100,000.
100,000 at least. And by the way, this happened under the eyes of the UNIFIL. I mean, the idea of having any kind of a talk between Lebanon and Israel is not something that anyone talks about it in Lebanon. I don't think so.
Pretty far down the list, I guess.
Let me jump on that.
There is something even more than that. At a certain point, Lebanese were entertaining the idea of peace with Israel, and they wanted to negotiate something with Israel. Now the country is turning, or it's turned also by Hezbollah to be a more militant country than a peace-leaning country.
Ambassador, you want to jump in?
Yes, because I think this is a key point. We've been there before. After the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, we thought we saw the opportunity to transform not just Lebanon, but the region. And that led to a negotiation between the governments of Israel and Lebanon face to face. It produced actually a peace agreement. The May 17, 1983 peace agreement between Lebanon and Israel. And I'm sure many of your viewers are scratching their heads saying, you know, what agreement? It is buried in the sands of history. It was dead on arrival. And it had its impact. It was a huge facilitator for Hezbollah, which could then style itself as the effective Lebanese resistance. And that is, of course, the trope they have sounded now for many years. So yeah, we've been there, we've done that, it didn't work. And it will not work until there is an independent authority in Lebanon that can make its own decisions, not coming to a theater near you anytime soon, but if we can again build on the momentum of this tragic blast in the Beirut port, we might get some traction. And it's also interesting to note how complex all of this is. The president of Lebanon was the main factor in the closure of our embassy for almost 2 years in the early 80s. That was a time when he was on the extreme right, if you will, of the Christian community, threatening to do to the American embassy what the Iranians had done to our embassy in Tehran. Well, now he is a wholly owned subsidiary of Hezbollah. So again, I think it is going after Hezbollah. We don't want to let up on the terrorism charges, obviously, but misgovernance, malfeasance, inability, corruption. That is one of their sources of strength, to tell the Lebanese people, we stand for you against a corrupt government. Well, now they are the corrupt government. And I really think we have an opportunity here with an active and engaged French president to rally the international community to pressure the Lebanese government, not just on the terrorism issues, but also on the malfeasance issues. I hope we take it.
It's important to point out that not too long after that May 1983 agreement, many Americans lost their lives in Beirut as well.
Yeah, well, that haunts me today. I was up last night kind of looking at some of the records from that time. Yeah, October 23, 1983, the bombing of the Marine barracks. 244 dead American servicemen. 6 months before, the bombing of the US Embassy, where I was a survivor. Yep. So there's a long, nasty history here. We actually got out early and lucky to do so. Israel maintained its presence from 82 all the way up to 2000, 18 years. What did they leave Lebanon with? They left with nothing, except more than 1,100 IDF killed. So I hope that as we take stock here, we are appropriately cautious. Lebanon is a very, very dangerous place. What certainly Israelis thought at the time, get rid of the PLO and all will be well. They got rid of the PLO and they got Hezbollah. So it's a long game here. We have to hunker down, think strategically, and consider how we can proceed with our allies. Not a time for unilateral action, but even less, it is a time to continue to ignore Lebanon. Nothing good happens if we try to pretend it just isn't there. It is.
Thank you. Pierre, just a final question to you before I open it up to our viewers. How can the Lebanese diaspora help restructure Lebanon, help rebuild Lebanon? Are there ways that you and others Lebanese abroad can do something to help change the situation in your country, your native country?
The immediate one is that the number of remittance that the Lebanese diaspora do every year is, according to the World Bank, over $7 billion. Then we do a lot in helping families and investing in the country. And I hope that Lebanese are continuing doing so, and I'm a witness of this kind of direct help. Then you pay to your mom and dad, you pay to your brother, to your sister, to cousins, you know, and you try to help them as much as possible. The other thing is the political one, is that many Lebanese do feel that the US government can help, but they are not organized in a way to tell in one voice what the US government should be doing or saying to the Lebanese. It is more like there are parties, there are people who are active in this country. They are always trying to tell the US government, stay interested, especially stay connected with the Lebanese army, but they don't go much beyond this point. I'm someone, if you allow me to say it, is I feel that there are two small things that can make a lot of difference. First is that the US government needs to find friends in Lebanon. There are many Lebanese back home who have a lot of respect to the US, cherish America, but they feel that's been disappointed many times. The Lebanese, they did mistakes, but also they always felt that that America is a short runner. Mr. Ambassador talked at least twice about a strategy and a long term. And this is something that the Lebanese would really like to hear, is that America needs to have a strategy for Lebanon and needs to have a long term, and not to have one president who wished to do something and start something and another president will change it and do exactly the opposite. We suffered because of that, on top of our own shortcomings. Definitely America can do a lot. Definitely America needs to find friends, and definitely America needs to be active. I don't want to criticize what Ambassador Hale did say about Lebanon, but definitely he said that it is up to the Lebanese to fix their problems. Well, the Lebanese are not going to fix their problems. Lebanese needs help.
Pierre, thank you. I think at this point we'll open it to our viewers. Belle?
Thank you to all of you for that very interesting conversation so far. Our first question comes from Hubert Avery in Paris, who says, Lebanon, like Iraq, has a diverse ethnic population. Can you talk about the interaction between Lebanon's Christian, Sunni, and Shia populations? Is this dynamic and political system responsible for much of the turmoil and troubles of Lebanon for decades? And if that's the case, are the country's youth in particular still committed to upholding this strong ties to ethnic identities, or looking to change the status quo? And perhaps, Pierre, we can start with you.
Who would like to jump for that? Ambassador?
I think this was directed at Pierre.
Pierre?
Oh, thank you. Okay. For me, Lebanese identity is something that was made over the last 200 years, where people from different communities came and lived together and accepted each other as communities and their traditions and their faith, and they lived together. And then we had the Lebanese state. Now, the Lebanese state is built on a sharing in between communities, sharing power in between communities. It didn't look nice, but it kept the country open and it kept the interaction. Someone who went to the American University of Beirut, or went to the Lebanese University, or went to the Jesuit University of Beirut, or like my dad who worked in Beirut. We are from a village, but my dad worked in West Beirut for a very long time, had a great experience with other fellow Lebanese. It is a wonderful country. The war took us maybe back 100 years. The ethnic cleansing that happened during the war at the hands of different factions did a lot of bad things. The biggest danger to Lebanon at this moment is that, one, the number of some communities is shrinking, and specifically here, the Christian community. Many villages didn't go back to live together. And now the financial crisis is hitting very hard the communities that are not Shia, that are not Hezbollah. And this is very dangerous.
Bill?
Thank you. Our next question comes from Ben Becker in Houston, who asks, could our guests please help us explain or understand, why France continues to block any EU effort to recognize Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization? What is the French strategy here? Perhaps, Ambassador, we can start with you.
It's a very important question. The relationship between France and Lebanon is a long-standing one. One goes back to the 19th century. Fighting in the mountains of Mount Lebanon, the Shuf, between Maronites and Muslims, particularly the Druze, in the 19th century, produced a situation in which France intervened directly. So they have a special relationship, if you will, in Lebanon that goes back almost 2 centuries now. What brought them into Lebanon, of course, was support for the Maronite Christian community. That needs to broaden, and I think under President Macron, we are seeing that effort to broaden. So what I think we need to do is sit down with the French and have a strategic conversation. Why do they not support the designation of Hezbollah? Well, that is obviously for the French to answer. My assessment is, of course, they see Hezbollah as part of the Lebanese political landscape, and that one has to work with them, therefore, and not to designate them an untouchable. I think that is fundamentally flawed, but this would be the time for the United States to have a conversation with France on a longer term strategy that might actually work. And here again, because we don't do history well in this country, the French have paid a lot for their engagement in Lebanon. It wasn't just the Marine barracks that were blown up that October morning in 1983. It was also the French barracks. They lost over 80 of their personnel in that bombing. So we are invested in blood, if you will. We need to think strategically here, and we need to think strategically with a partner, and that partner under President Macron, I think initially, is France.
Thank you for that, Ambassador. We'll continue to work on this as well with our partners in Europe. Belle, next question.
Thank you. We're getting a lot of questions. Obviously, our esteemed guests are quite familiar with the role of Hezbollah in Lebanon, but many people are asking, for those of us who are not familiar, can you paint a picture for us? If you're an average Lebanese person on the street, what does the role of Hezbollah look like to you in that country? What does it mean? Is Hezbollah de facto running the country? Is that clearly visible? Can you paint more of a picture for us?
Pierre?
At this moment, yes, the Lebanese do realize that the only organized party that has guns and controls almost everything in the country is Hezbollah. That's what the people on the streets are saying. And some people like it so much, and those are like the pro-Hezbollah people. Some people are living with it, and some people are terrorized because of it. But definitely, the idea of Hezbollah being a resistance is long gone. The idea of Hezbollah to be the power in Lebanon is well entrenched. The idea that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization is not something that the Lebanese talk about, because they are not so much aware of it, or they are terrorized because of it.
Thank you, Pierre. Bill?
Thank you. Ray Termini in Dallas is asking, the Fars news agency, which is affiliated with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, has claimed that various news media outlets were taking advantage of the recent explosion to tarnish Hezbollah. How will this claim play out in Iran, and do you anticipate any Iranian action in response to claims that Hezbollah might be responsible or needs to be disciplined? Perhaps Ambassador.
Well, the notion that Iran would seek to discipline Hezbollah is fanciful, to say the very least. But the question gets at something important as we see a shift in regional dynamics. Iran is on the defensive. Huge problems within the country as the economy goes through a very, very rough period. And here is something I would commend the Trump administration for, and believe me, there was not much I would commend them for. Keeping the pressure on Iran, making sanctions bite, do everything we can to weaken them. Hezbollah is an expensive proposition for them. And they have had to spend a lot of capital, human and financial, to keep Hezbollah in the fight in Syria, which is a core issue for Iran. That strategic alliance, almost literally since the birth of the Islamic Republic between Damascus and Tehran. It is the only Arab country that has supported Iran, is of vital importance to them. So we're not going to see Iran decide that Hezbollah needs to be checked for better outcomes in Lebanon. But I think what we do see is a moment in which Iran is struggling mightily under the economic pressures that we have been in the forefront of imposing. And Hezbollah itself is forced to answer questions if their purpose is the safety and security of Lebanon and the Lebanese. What are they doing in Syria, where thousands of their fighters have already died? So there is a moment here, again, for some creative and persuasive diplomacy on our part. And again, the Trump administration, I think, has, to an extent, set the terms for that in a productive way. I am much less encouraged by their ability to sustain a multinational, multilateral diplomatic campaign to weaken Hezbollah in Lebanon and elsewhere if we can. That's what we need now. We need that multilateral effort. Unfortunately, I do not see it coming from this U.S. administration.
Bill, before you pose the next question, let me come back to something that the ambassador was just talking about, which is basically the U.S. role in the Middle East generally. The Trump administration's position, not only regarding Iran, but really other countries in the region. Ambassador, what we've seen with the UAE-Israel agreement and messages of support, basically, for the administration's policies from a number of Gulf states as well, Arabian Gulf states, is a different look for the United States in the region, maybe a different level of regard and respect for the United States. Are you seeing some other positive aspects of administration policy in that region?
Well, Jason, that's a great point, and I'm glad you brought it up. It's been kind of downplayed, including by the administration itself. But I think the UAE-Israel peace agreement is literally historic, transformative potentially. It is, of course, the third Arab state after Egypt and Jordan to enter into a formal peace with Israel. It is the first Gulf state to take that action. It is potentially extremely important in moving the dynamic in the region to a much better place than it has been. I've noticed that some of those long invested in the peace process are somewhat dismissive of the achievement, I guess because it came under the Trump administration. Again, I'm not a big fan of that administration, but look, credit where credit is due. This is important. And I would like to think it's woven into a broader strategy for the administration. I don't think it is. Not that that cannot be adjusted now, it still can. Probably not until after the election, but this is potentially highly transformative, both as pressure against Iran, but also in the broader region, including in Lebanon. So we should take this achievement and then do what I think is pretty obvious. How do you start there and then go farther? Again, complicated inter-Arab relationships, not least between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, are all a factor. What I would urge is that organizations, that the American public, recognize it for the very important step it is. And in this sense, as arms sales questions are now being tabled, I think we need to be very careful about taking immediate public steps, whether in Israel or here in the United States, to say, nope, we should not sell the UAE this, that, or the other. We don't need to move into a set of negative exchanges. We need to build on something that is positive and historic. And I think that means an outreach in the region, particularly to the UAE itself, to say, you made the right call. You are on the right side of history, and we're going to support you. Doesn't mean a blank check. Doesn't mean that we say that whatever you want, you've got. But I do think we need to understand the strategic potential that we have right now in the region because of this agreement.
Ambassador, I think, as you know, the AJC has been doing exactly that kind of outreach for a very long time. I remember, as we were writing the other day, that David Harris and I actually saw you when you were the ambassador in Kuwait about 25 years ago as part of our effort to reach out to countries across the region. We're very excited about the potential from last week's milestone. Belle, another question?
Thank you, Jason. I'm going to ask two more questions and turn it back over to you. David Levy is asking, who are the up-and-coming leaders in Lebanon who perhaps can help lift the country out of the current situation? And are there any particular names that we should be on the lookout for? Pierre, perhaps to you.
Well, I will. I can't really give names for a reason, is that most of the leaders that are now leading parties or communities, political communities in Lebanon, are known, are there, they've been in their positions for at least the last 30 years. Many of them are warlords. I don't really have an answer to this one, but definitely there may be leaders of the NGOs. There may be some people in Lebanon that believe in having a state that is not corrupt, that is not under the pressure of Hezbollah. They are there, but they are not organized.
Thank you. And our last question comes from Richard Kramer in Sharon, Massachusetts, who writes, the Russians seem to have gained new ground in the region, particularly in recent years, as we discussed with Syria. To what extent, if any, is Russia a factor with respect to Lebanon, or are there any other major players who have not been mentioned that should be on our radar when thinking about the situation in the country? Perhaps, Ambassador, if you'd like to start.
That is an excellent question. In my view, Russia is at full extension with its engagements in the Middle East and elsewhere. Their economy is beyond bad in Russia, and the Russians, as well as the Americans, need to keep that in focus. It was, as much as anything, economic failure that brought down the Soviet Union. Military adventures beyond one's borders are fraught with all kinds of mischance, and they are expensive. Just ask us. So I don't think Russia is in a position to go beyond where they are right now. And let's not forget, in Syria, that was defensive on the part of the Russians. They intervened to shore up the failing regime of Bashar al-Assad because, like Iran, for different reasons, Russia doesn't have friends in the Middle East except the Syrian regime. So they were playing defense, and they played it brilliantly. And I do have to say, not only did we play our hand poorly, and this goes back to the Obama administration, we didn't really play it at all. All of that said, I don't think the Russians are in a position to go anywhere beyond where they are now, except rhetorically. And historically, they have never played a significant role in Lebanon. You know, again, I was there for 2 tours, total of 6 years, under very different circumstances. The Russians just weren't a power. But the broader question here, who else could have influence and significance? There's a real opportunity. I would like to see us, again, making the effort to re-engage the Saudis on this, who historically, through their checkbook, played a role of significance in Lebanon. I'd like to see us engage the Egyptians, the Jordanians, and of course, Israel. And on that score, maybe not that anyone needs the caution, let's not do anything dumb. The 82 Israeli invasion, which we effectively green-lighted, that got rid of the PLO in the south and its ability to threaten Israel and its northern towns and settlements in particular. But it brought us Hezbollah, and we are both paying that price and have paid it for decades. So this is a time of opportunity. It is also a time to be very, very careful, very cautious, and be informed by what we've experienced in the past, which was absolutely not good for either us or for Israel.
Thank you, Ambassador, for those comments. And Pierre, it's good to see you again, and thank you for taking part in this discussion. And Ambassador Crocker, after many decades of contact with us and your wisdom on these issues, it really was very good again to have you in front of an AJC audience. Belle, I think that concludes this very important discussion.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you to our esteemed guests for such a fascinating and important conversation. I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us. And if you enjoyed this program and hopefully learned from it as well, please consider making a donation to AJC at ajc.org/donate. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.